Chapter 1. The Yellow Box. At its peak, Kodak sold enough film to circle the Earth. The factory complex in Rochester, New York, stretched across 200 acres, 145,000 employees, 90% of the American film market. A stock price on the Dow Jones Industrial Average alongside General Electric and IBM and Coca-Cola. The company name had become the English word for photography, the way Kleenex had become the word for tissue. George Eastman built all of it from a bank clerk's obsession with chemistry. In the 1870s, Eastman was working at the Rochester Savings Bank, earning $15 a week when he became interested in photography. Not as an art form, as a problem. Photography in the 1870s required a wooden box camera the size of a suitcase, glass plates coated in wet silver nitrate emulsion, a portable darkroom, and roughly 20 minutes of a subject sitting perfectly still. It was expensive, physically demanding, and completely inaccessible to anyone without training or money. Eastman saw the gap between the demand and the product. Millions of people wanted photographs. Almost nobody could take them. The obstacle wasn't desire, it was chemistry. He taught himself the chemistry. Nights after work, weekends, holidays. In his mother's kitchen, he experimented with dry plate emulsions, trying to find a photosensitive coating that could be applied to a flexible strip rather than a rigid glass plate. He burned through batches. He ruined his mother's cookware. He slept beside his experiments because some of the emulsions needed to be monitored for hours. By the mid-1880s, he had it. A flexible film strip coated with a light-sensitive emulsion that could be wound onto a spool and loaded into a small, simple camera. No glass plates, no portable darkroom, no chemistry degree required. In 1888, the first Kodak camera went on sale. A small black box, preloaded with enough film for 100 exposures. When the roll was finished, the owner mailed the entire camera back to Rochester. Kodak developed the photographs, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and mailed everything back. The slogan was 6 words. "You press the button, we do the rest." It was not a marketing line, it was a contract, a promise made to millions of people who had never held a camera before. Give us your trust, we will preserve your memories. You don't need to understand the chemistry or the optics or the processing. You just press the button. Families pressed the button, by the millions, then the tens of millions, birthdays, weddings, graduations, holidays, vacations, funerals, first days of school, last days of summer. The yellow Kodak box became the physical object through which America recorded itself. Kodak film went to both world wars. Kodak film documented the liberation of concentration camps. Kodak film flew to the moon with Apollo 11. When Abraham Zapruder stood on a concrete pedestal in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963, and filmed the assassination of President Kennedy, the camera was loaded with Kodak Kodachrome 2.8mm film. 26 seconds of footage on a Kodak product became arguably the most scrutinized piece of film in human history. The business model that powered all of it was elegant and ruthless. Cameras were sold cheaply, sometimes below cost. The profit was in the film. Every roll of Kodak film carried an estimated profit margin above 70%. A family that bought a Kodak camera in 1965 would buy Kodak film for the next 30 years. Every birthday, every Christmas, every vacation, another yellow box, another $3, another 70% margin, razor and blade. Sell the handle. Make the money on the refills. Except Kodak's version was more powerful than Gillette's because you couldn't switch brands midstream. Once your camera took Kodak film, you bought Kodak film. The ecosystem was closed. By 1976, the Rochester factory complex employed more people than any other private employer in Western New York. The city's tax base, its school system, its hospitals, its orchestra, its university, all of it funded directly or indirectly by Kodak money. George Eastman had donated more than $100 million to Rochester institutions during his lifetime. He founded the Eastman School of Music. He funded the University of Rochester's medical school. He built a theater. He built parks. In Rochester, people did not say they worked in photography. They said they worked for Kodak. 3 generations of families passed through those factory gates. A grandfather who coated film in the 1940s. A father who ran a press in the 1970s. A son who managed quality control in the 1990s. Kodak Man was a term of identity, not just employment. It meant you had a good job. It meant your family was stable. It meant you belonged to something. The Kodak Tower, a 19-story Art Deco building on State Street, dominated the Rochester skyline the way a cathedral dominates a medieval town. It was the tallest building in the city, visible from miles away. The physical manifestation of a company that believed, with the quiet confidence of an institution that has been profitable for a century, that the money would never stop. In 1975, one of their employees proved them right, and then they buried what he'd built. Chapter 2. The Engineer in the Basement. Steve Sasson was 24 years old, an electrical engineer 1 year out of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, working in Kodak's apparatus division in a building that was not the main factory, not the executive suite, not anywhere that corporate leadership visited regularly. It was the Skunk Works, the place where engineers tinkered. His supervisor, Gareth Lloyd, gave him an assignment in 1974 that neither man understood the significance of. A new electronic sensor had appeared on the market, a charge-coupled device, or CCD, manufactured by Fairchild Semiconductor. The sensor could detect light and convert it into an electrical signal. Lloyd wanted to know if there was anything useful Kodak could do with it. Sasson took the assignment and disappeared into the lab. The world he was working in had no framework for what he was attempting. There were no personal computers, no internet, no digital storage beyond magnetic tape. The most advanced consumer electronics in American homes were color televisions and pocket calculators. The idea of converting a photograph into ones and zeros and storing it as data, that concept existed in theoretical research papers at Bell Labs and nowhere else. Sasson had to build everything himself. He used a lens from a Kodak Super 8 movie camera, a Motorola analog-to-digital converter that had just become available, a CCD sensor, and for storage, because digital data had to go somewhere, he wired in a standard audio cassette tape, the kind used in answering machines and Walkmans. It was the highest capacity portable storage medium available to him. The assembly took about a year. The finished prototype weighed 8 pounds and was roughly the size of a toaster. Wires ran between components. Nothing about it looked like a camera. It looked like a science fair project built by someone who knew what they were doing but had no budget. In December 1975, Sasson pointed it at a lab technician named Joy Marshall and pressed the trigger. 23 seconds. That's how long the image capture and storage process took. 23 seconds of silence while the CCD converted light into voltage, the converter turned voltage into binary data, and the cassette tape recorder wrote the data onto magnetic tape. Then Sasson connected the tape to a playback unit he'd also built, plugged it into a standard television, and waited. Joy Marshall's face appeared on the screen, black and white, 0.01 megapixels, 100 pixels by 100 pixels, grainy, barely recognizable, closer to an abstract impression than a photograph. Modern phone cameras are roughly 10,000 times more detailed. But it was a photograph, captured without film, stored as data, displayed on a screen. The entire chain of events that defines digital photography in 2026 had just occurred for the first time in a basement lab in Rochester, New York, in December 1975. Sasson understood what he'd built. He was young, but he wasn't naive. In later interviews, he described the meeting where he presented the prototype to Kodak's senior management. They asked the obvious question: how long before this technology is good enough to replace film? His answer was specific and, as it turned out, almost perfectly accurate. 15 to 20 years. 15 to 20 years of runway. A generation of lead time. An opportunity that no competitor on Earth possessed because no other company had a working digital camera prototype. And Kodak's own patent filing would shortly ensure that no other company could build one without Kodak's permission. The response from management, as Sasson has described it, was not hostile. It was not angry. It was something worse than both. It was polite disinterest. They told him to keep working on it. They told him not to discuss it publicly. They did not fund a product development team. They did not assign a commercial strategy. They did not tell anyone outside the building that one of their engineers had just built the successor to their most profitable product. They filed a patent in 1978. United States Patent 4,131,919. Electronic still camera. The patent documented the technology, assigned the intellectual property to Eastman Kodak Company, and ensured that anyone who subsequently developed a digital camera would need to license Kodak's work. Then they locked it away. The logic was internally coherent. Film generated 70% margins. Digital photography, if it succeeded, would eventually eliminate the need for film. Every dollar spent accelerating digital was a dollar spent hastening the death of the most profitable product in the company's history. The rational move, the spreadsheet move, was to develop digital slowly, on Kodak's own timeline, while extracting maximum revenue from film for as long as possible. The people who made this decision were not stupid. They were not short-sighted in the conventional sense. They had identified the threat accurately. They had quantified the timeline correctly. And they had concluded, with the deliberate, documented reasoning of experienced executives, that managing the transition gradually would protect shareholder value better than disrupting their own business. They were wrong. But their wrongness was not a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of courage. They understood the future. They chose not to build it. Chapter 3. The Licensing Trap. What Kodak did instead of building digital cameras is one of the most quietly devastating corporate strategies in American business history. They became a patent licensing company. And the licensing strategy, examined in full, is one of the most elegant acts of self-destruction in corporate history. Between 1975 and the early 2000s, Kodak's research division continued developing digital imaging technology at a pace that would have been remarkable for a company that intended to use it. They built better sensors. They refined image compression algorithms. They advanced color reproduction systems. They developed storage architectures. Their engineers filed patent after patent, more than 1,000 in total, building one of the most comprehensive intellectual property portfolios in the technology sector. The engineers who did this work were, in many cases, brilliant. They were solving problems at the frontier of electronic imaging. They were publishing papers. They were attending conferences. They believed, reasonably, that they were building the foundation for Kodak's digital future, that the company would eventually use what they were creating. The company did use it as a toll booth. Kodak licensed its digital imaging patents to Canon, to Nikon, to Sony, to Fuji, to Samsung, to virtually every electronics manufacturer in the world that was building digital cameras. The licensing terms generated enormous revenue. Over 2 decades, Kodak collected between $3 and $4 billion in patent royalties. 3 to 4 billion. Enough to fund an entire digital camera division. Enough to build a streaming photo platform. Enough to buy Netflix twice over in the year 2000. The money flowed in. The quarterly reports looked strong. The board saw a profitable digital strategy. Wall Street analysts noted approvingly that Kodak was monetizing its technology assets. Nobody panicked, and nobody noticed the trap. Because the trap had 3 components, and each one was invisible from inside the boardroom. The first component, education. Every licensing agreement came with technical documentation. Patent licenses are not abstract permissions. They are detailed engineering specifications. When Canon licensed Kodak's CCD sensor technology, Canon's engineers received the data they needed to understand how the sensor worked, how it processed light, how it converted optical information into electronic signals. They didn't have to figure it out themselves. Kodak had figured it out for them and charged them for the privilege of learning. The second component, subsidy. The licensing fees that Canon and Nikon and Sony paid to Kodak were, for those companies, a cost of doing business. A line item in their R&D budget. And every dollar they saved by licensing Kodak's patents, rather than independently developing the technology through years of expensive research, was a dollar they could invest in something Kodak was not doing: building, manufacturing, marketing, and selling digital cameras to consumers. Kodak's patent fees didn't weaken the competition. They strengthened it. They gave competitors a shortcut past the most expensive phase of product development, fundamental research, and allowed them to invest directly in the phases that actually generate revenue, production and sales. The third component, complacency. As long as licensing revenue flowed, Kodak's leadership had a plausible answer to every uncomfortable question about the digital transition. Are you investing in digital? Yes, our patent portfolio is one of the largest in the industry. Are you generating revenue from digital? Yes, billions in licensing fees. Are you positioned for the future? Yes. Every digital camera sold in the world uses our technology. All true, and all meaningless. Because the question that mattered, are you building digital cameras that consumers will buy, went unasked, or when asked, was answered with the DC-40 at $995. Meanwhile, the market moved and would not stop. Sony released the Mavica. Not truly digital. It stored analog images on magnetic floppy disks, but filmless, a camera without film, manufactured by one of the most aggressive consumer electronics companies on Earth. The signal could not have been clearer. Kodak commissioned a study. The study concluded that digital photography was approximately 10 years from commercial viability. The Japanese competitors did not commission studies. They built cameras. Throughout the 1980s, Canon, Nikon, Sony, and Fuji invested billions in digital imaging R&D. They had no film margins to protect, No board asking whether each new digital product would cannibalize an existing revenue stream. No internal tension between a profitable past and an uncertain future. They were free to innovate in a way that Kodak, structurally and psychologically, was not. Kodak's own engineers saw it. Internal memos from the mid-1980s show repeated warnings that the competitive timeline was compressing, that the 10-year window from the Mavica study was shrinking, that Japanese manufacturers were achieving quality benchmarks faster than anyone in Rochester had predicted. The memos went up the chain, the responses came back down. Stay the course. In 1986, Kodak's research division produced a 1.4 megapixel CCD sensor, the first sensor capable of capturing a genuinely photo-quality digital image, a technical achievement that should have been the launching point for an entire product line. Kodak licensed it. They sold the specifications to the companies that would use them to build the cameras that would make Kodak's film business obsolete. And they collected royalties. And the quarterly report looked fine. Chapter 4. The Man Who Tried. George Fisher arrived at Kodak in December 1993. He had been recruited personally by the board of directors, offered a compensation package that reflected the scale of the task, and given what amounted to a mandate: save the company. His credentials justified the faith. At Motorola, he had inherited a struggling electronics manufacturer and transformed it into a global communications leader. The Motorola turnaround was studied at Harvard Business School. Fisher was profiled in Fortune, in Businessweek, in every publication that covered American corporate leadership. He was, in the early 1990s, one of the 5 or 10 most respected executives in the country. He arrived in Rochester and found a company that was, in his later description, paralyzed by its own history. The phrase he used most often in interviews was, "too comfortable with its own dominance." The culture was not hostile to change. It was something worse. It was unable to imagine change. The idea that film would decline was understood intellectually by most senior managers. The idea that Kodak needed to become something fundamentally different was understood by almost nobody. The institutional resistance was not organized opposition. It was inertia. The weight of 145,000 people doing the same thing they had always done, in the same buildings, with the same materials, for the same customers. The manufacturing workers on the film production lines were not sabotaging the digital transition. They were simply continuing to make film, because that was their job, and nobody had told them to do something else. The middle managers were not blocking digital investment. They were optimizing film sales because that was what their performance metrics measured, and nobody had changed the metrics. Fisher changed the metrics. He restructured the organization. He created a digital imaging division. He hired engineers from Silicon Valley. He invested in research. He did everything that a competent, visionary CEO could reasonably be expected to do. And the organization moved at the speed of an aircraft carrier executing a turn. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, degrees at a time, while speedboats named Canon and Nikon cut past on both sides. In 1995, Kodak released the DC-40, their first consumer digital camera. 0.38 megapixels, $995. A film camera that took objectively superior photographs was available at the same Kodak counter for $30. A roll of 36 exposure Kodak gold film cost $3.29. The pricing was not an accident. It was architecture. The DC-40 was priced to avoid cannibalizing film, to exist in the market without threatening the revenue stream that paid for the Rochester campus and the 145,000 salaries and the pension fund and the Kodak Tower and everything else. It was a product designed to demonstrate digital capability without actually disrupting the analog business. Canon and Nikon and Sony and Olympus, unburdened by film revenue, priced their digital cameras to sell and sold them. Through the late 1990s, Fisher watched the gap widen. He pushed for faster investment. He argued for more aggressive pricing. He told the board, in terms that grew increasingly urgent, that the window was closing. The board listened, partially, occasionally, with the careful, measured responsiveness of people who understood what Fisher was saying and were not prepared to accept the full implications of acting on it. Because the full implications meant accepting that film revenue, the revenue that funded everything, would decline, possibly rapidly, and that the digital revenue meant to replace it was not yet large enough to fill the gap. Fisher needed the board to accept a period of pain, a dip, a valley, a transition during which the old revenue would fall and the new revenue would not yet have risen to meet it. Every corporate transformation requires this passage through the valley, and boards, constitutionally, hate valleys. In 1999, Nikon released the D1. Canon followed. Professional photographers began switching, and once the professionals switched, the cascade was inevitable. Fisher left in 2000. The accounts vary on whether he was pushed or chose to go. The result was the same. His replacement, Daniel Karp, was a Kodak lifer, 30 years inside the building. A man who knew every corridor, every conference room, every production line. A man who understood Kodak. What Kodak needed was someone who understood what Kodak needed to stop being. In 2003, 28 years after Steve Sassen's prototype, 22 years after the Sony Mavica, 10 years after George Fisher's arrival, 4 years after the professional photographers began switching, digital cameras outsold film cameras in the United States for the first time. Kodak announced an all-in digital strategy, billions in investment, 15,000 layoffs, a complete restructuring. The company would become a digital imaging company. It was 28 years too late, and even now, even as the announcement was being made, the cost structure remained. The factories remained. The pension obligations remained. The Rochester campus remained. The overhead of a 70% margin business persisted while the revenue transitioned to 5% margin products. The math could not work. And it did not work. Chapter 5. The Cruel Irony. By 2005, Kodak's EasyShare line was the best-selling digital camera brand in the United States. Read that again. The best-selling. After decades of delay, after fumbling the digital transition for an entire generation, after watching Canon and Nikon and Sony build the market without them, Kodak had finally produced digital cameras that customers wanted. The EasyShare cameras were well-designed, competitively priced, and backed by the most recognizable photography brand on Earth. It didn't matter. The problem was arithmetic. Film had carried 70% margins. Digital cameras carried 5%, maybe, on a good quarter, in a favorable market. Kodak's cost structure, the factories, the workforce, the distribution network, the corporate overhead, had been built for 70% margin products. Every building in Rochester, every employee badge, every lease payment, every pension obligation, every line in the budget reflected a company designed to operate on 70-cent profits for every dollar of revenue. Digital cameras returned 5 cents on the dollar. The math could not work. Kodak was trying to run a food truck with the overhead of a five-star restaurant. The food might be good. The economics would kill you. Then came the other failures. Kodak EasyShare Gallery, an online photo-sharing platform, launched to compete with Shutterfly and Snapfish and the rising tide of social media. It never gained meaningful market share. The platform was clunky, the user experience was mediocre, and Kodak kept trying to funnel users toward purchasing prints, physical products with margins Kodak understood, while the rest of the world was sharing photos digitally for free on Facebook. The consumer inkjet printer venture consumed hundreds of millions. Kodak's pitch, cheaper ink than HP or Canon, was sound in principle and irrelevant in practice. HP and Canon had decades of distribution relationships, retail shelf space, and brand loyalty in the printer market. Kodak was a photography company trying to sell office equipment. The printers never turned a profit. Each failed pivot consumed capital, management attention, and the remaining credibility of a company that was running out of all three. Then, on January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and held up a phone. Chapter 6. The phone that finished it. The iPhone did not compete with Kodak. That framing misunderstands what happened. The iPhone made Kodak's entire product category irrelevant. Not just film, digital cameras too. All of them. Every dedicated consumer camera became, within a decade of the iPhone's launch, an object that most people no longer needed. The mechanism was simple. The iPhone put a camera in every pocket. Not a good camera. Not in 2007. The original iPhone's 2-megapixel sensor produced mediocre images by any technical standard. But the camera was always there. Always accessible. No separate device to carry, no memory card to manage, no cable to connect, no software to install. And the photos went everywhere instantly. The iPhone connected to the internet. A photograph taken at a birthday party could be shared with 20 people before the cake was cut. No developing, no waiting, no drugstore, no yellow box. The old photography wisdom, the best camera is the one you have with you, became literal, and the camera most people had with them was a phone. Kodak's digital camera division, the thing they had finally built after 28 years of delay, entered decline. Not because the cameras were bad, because the market had moved past cameras entirely. Chapter 7. Rochester. The layoffs came in waves, each wave larger than the last, each wave stripping another layer from a city that had been built around a single company. 15,000 jobs in one announcement, then 10,000 more, then 8,000, then 5,000. The numbers accumulated over a decade until the total was almost incomprehensible. 136,500 jobs eliminated between the peak and the trough. From 145,000 employees to approximately 8,500. Rochester absorbed each wave the way a coastline absorbs a storm surge, slowly at first, then all at once. The neighborhoods around the factory complex, modest, well-kept homes bought with Kodak wages, maintained with Kodak benefits, valued by proximity to Kodak employment, began to empty. For sale signs appeared in clusters, then foreclosure notices. Property values declined, the tax base eroded, schools that had been well-funded cut programs. Infrastructure maintenance was deferred. The library reduced its hours. The workers themselves faced a particular cruelty. Their skills were hyper-specialized. The chemical engineers who had spent 2 decades perfecting photographic emulsions could not transfer that knowledge to another industry. The manufacturing technicians who had operated Kodak's film coating machines, machines that existed nowhere else on Earth, had expertise that was simultaneously irreplaceable and unemployable. No other company needed people who knew how to coat cellulose triacetate with silver halide crystals at industrial speed. Kodak was the only company that had ever needed that, and Kodak was shrinking. Some left Rochester entirely. Engineers migrated to the technology corridors of California and Texas and North Carolina. They started over. Some rebuilt careers in adjacent industries. Many took significant pay cuts and never recovered their previous earning level. Some stayed. Chemical engineers became retail workers. Machinists became delivery drivers. People who had earned $70,000 or $80,000 a year doing skilled technical work found themselves making $30,000 doing work that used none of what they'd spent decades learning. And some, particularly the older workers, the ones in their 50s who were too young to retire and too experienced to be hired at entry level, fell out of the workforce entirely. They burned through savings. They cashed out 401k plans that were often heavy with Kodak stock, which was falling toward zero. They applied for unemployment, then disability, then early Social Security. The Kodak man identity, the pride, the stability, the sense of belonging, dissolved. The Kodak Tower still stands on State Street. 19 stories of Art Deco ambition, visible from miles away, dominating the Rochester skyline the way it has since 1914. It was once the tallest building in the city and the physical center of an economic universe that revolved around a single company. George Eastman's name is still on the music school, still on the theater, still on the dental clinic. The institutions survived their benefactor's company. The city that Kodak built is still there. It is smaller, quieter, less certain of what it is now that the thing it was built around is mostly gone. Chapter 8. The Patent Suit and the Bankruptcy. In 2011, Kodak's legal department filed patent infringement lawsuits against Apple and HTC. The claims centered on Kodak's digital imaging patents, the same patents that had generated billions in licensing fees over 2 decades. The lawsuits were a tell. When a company that once held 90% of the American photography market is suing technology companies over patent royalties instead of competing with products, the strategic position is clear. Kodak had nothing left to sell except the blueprints of the technology they had invented and then failed to commercialize. They were trying to extract value from the very innovations they had chosen not to build. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. The stock, which had traded at $94 per share in 1997, was worth 36 cents. The bankruptcy was not the end. Kodak emerged in 2013 as a much smaller company focused on commercial printing and packaging. The consumer photography business, the yellow box, the drugstore counter, the birthday party, and the graduation and the vacation, was gone. The brand still existed, licensed to other manufacturers who put the Kodak name on products that had no connection to Rochester. The film manufacturing that had once required 200 acres of factory space was reduced to a specialty operation. Kodak Alaris, a UK-based spin-off, continued to produce a limited range of film stocks for the small but persistent community of analog photographers who preferred the characteristics of chemical imaging. The film is manufactured in Rochester. The factory smells, presumably, the way it always smelled, of chemistry and industry and something irreplaceable being made in smaller and smaller quantities. Chapter 9. What the Yellow Box Knew. The standard telling of the Kodak story frames it as a cautionary tale about innovation, a case study in the innovator's dilemma, a lesson in how market-leading companies fail to adapt to disruptive technologies. This framing is incomplete. The innovator's dilemma describes a company that fails to see the threat. Kodak saw the threat. Their own engineer built it. They held it in their hands in 1975. They patented it. They quantified the timeline. They watched their competitors adopt it. They commissioned studies, received memos, held meetings, hired consultants, and eventually brought in one of the most capable turnaround CEOs in American business specifically to address it. Kodak did not fail to see the future. Kodak invented the future, and then, for 28 years, chose not to build it. The distinction matters. A company that fails to see a threat is tragic. A company that sees the threat clearly, understands it completely, and chooses to protect its margins instead of its customers. That is something else. While Kodak's executives were calculating how to maximize the remaining lifespan of film revenue, millions of families were buying yellow boxes at drugstores. They were pressing the button. They were trusting Kodak with their memories. They were keeping up their end of the 1888 contract, the one that said, "You press the button, we do the rest." And Kodak, knowing that a better way existed, knowing that their own engineer had built it, knowing that the yellow box was heading toward obsolescence, kept selling film, kept charging for processing, kept running the Kodak Moment advertisements, kept asking for trust while quietly collecting patent fees from the companies that were building the replacement. The Kodak Moment campaign ran for decades. Golden light, happy families, the implication that your most precious memories deserved Kodak film. Each advertisement was a request for trust. Each yellow box sold was a trust transaction. A family handing Kodak their birthday parties and their graduations and their vacations in exchange for the promise that Kodak would preserve them. Kodak honored the transaction. The film worked. The photographs were developed. The memories were preserved. But the larger promise, the implied promise, the one that every dominant brand makes to the people who depend on it, was that Kodak would continue to be the best way to preserve those memories. And that promise was broken the moment management decided to bury Steve Sassen's prototype and protect film margins instead. This is the pattern that repeats across American corporate history. Blockbuster knew late fees were driving customers away and kept charging them. Circuit City knew its commissioned salespeople were its competitive advantage and fired them. Sears knew mail-order retail was being reinvented online and watched. In each case, the company saw the future, understood the threat, and chose the spreadsheet over the customer, chose this quarter over next decade, chose the certain revenue of the present over the uncertain investment required by the future. The spreadsheet always wins until the company goes bankrupt, and then the spreadsheet loses too. Chapter 10. What Remains. Steve Sassen is still alive. He retired from Kodak in 2009 after 35 years with the company. In 2009, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, the highest honor the United States government bestows for technological achievement. The citation recognized what Kodak's management had tried to keep quiet for 3 decades. That Sassen's 1975 prototype was the foundational invention of digital photography. That everything, Every phone camera, every Instagram post, every digital photograph taken anywhere on Earth traces its lineage back to a 24-year-old engineer in a Rochester basement with a CCD sensor and a cassette tape. The prototype itself survives. It is held in the collection of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. 8 pounds of wires and circuit boards and a camera lens from a Super 8 movie camera, assembled with electrical tape and the kind of ingenuity that only emerges when someone is building something that has never existed before. Joy Marshall's face, the first digital photograph, 0.01 megapixels, black and white, stored on a cassette tape in December 1975, has been reproduced in hundreds of articles, books, and documentaries. It is one of the most historically significant images of the 20th century. Not for what it shows, for what it proved. The Rochester factory complex still exists, though much of it has been repurposed or demolished. The Kodak Tower still stands. The Eastman School of Music still operates. The institutions George Eastman built with his personal fortune outlasted the company that generated that fortune. And in drugstores that still carry a small rack of film, Kodak Gold, Kodak Ultramax, the yellow boxes smaller and fewer than they once were but still there, a version of the original promise persists. You press the button, we do the rest. Except now the rest is done by a phone, and the button is a glass screen, and the photographs never need developing because they were never on film. Nicholas Cover walked across Siberia and built Airfix from pocket money and polyirene. George Eastman taught himself chemistry in his mother's kitchen and built Kodak from a bank clerk's salary and a flexible strip of film. Both men built machines that put something into the hands of ordinary people that ordinary people had never been able to hold before. A model aircraft, a family photograph. The difference is that Eastman's company invented the replacement for its own product and chose to bury it. Cover never had that option. His company was killed by decisions made after he was gone, by people buying failing brands with money the core business had earned. Kodak killed itself, with knowledge, with data, with full awareness of what was coming and when it would arrive. They held the future in their hands, in a basement in Rochester, in December 1975. And they put it in a drawer. The drawer is in the Smithsonian now. The company is in the history books. And the yellow box, which once held the trust of every family in America, is a specialty product for enthusiasts in a market that has moved on. George Eastman's contract, you press the button, we do the rest, lasted 124 years. The company that made the contract lasted 124 years. The technology that could have extended both for another century was built by one of their own employees and suppressed by their own executives. That is not an innovator's dilemma. That is not a strategic miscalculation. That is not a case study in disruption. That is a company that knew what it owed the people who trusted it and chose not to pay.